All right, so I think we can get started. It's 4:15. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this 75-minute session where we will explore the potential of alternative proteins, plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation to make our food systems more resilient and sustainable. My name is Rafael Potselva. I work with the food awareness organization ProVeg International in Berlin. We work on reducing our dependency on animal-sourced protein, and we promote protein diversification and healthy plant-rich diets as key solution to the current climate emergency. I would like to thank the co-organizers of this side event, the Good Food Institute, GFI, Compassion in World Farming, and the Jeremy Coller Foundation. At the end of this session, we will also have at 5:30, ProVeg would also like to invite you to continue the discussion we will have with a small reception with drinks and plant-based snacks in front of the room. So let me start by saying that our food system is broken. We know that we have over 800 million people worldwide that are facing hunger and nutrition, while more than 40% of adults globally are overweight. On emissions, food systems represent around 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions, while animal agriculture alone accounts up to 20% of total greenhouse gas emissions. We know that around 80% of the world's farmland is used for livestock, even though these products only provide 37% of protein and 18% of calories to our diets. So we know that our current methods of meat production and also the consumption patterns, especially in the global north, are inefficient, but they're also driving greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, and food insecurity, not to mention the risk of pandemics and AMRs. The challenge we have to face is that meat consumption, according to the FAO, is expected to double by 2050. We also know that even if we would phase out fossil fuels today, we would not achieve the Paris Agreement without fundamentally transforming our food systems and making them more resilient. The IPCC regularly acknowledges that some of the most effective solutions to mitigate emissions from food systems are coming from plant-based alternatives and cultivated meats. So how do we unlock and how do we scale up the potential of alternative protein? This is what we're going to discuss today with, I think, a record panel of 8 people. I think also we'll be 8 speakers in total, but we managed to keep it to that. So our first speaker will be Liva Kaugure, who is National Resource Officer in the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO. Her main role entails facilitating capacity building efforts for nations to actively participate and contribute to climate change and agriculture negotiations at the UNFCCC. So Liva, in the next 5-6 minutes, could you give us FAO's perspective on alternative protein and the potential benefits from a climate mitigation and food security standpoint?
Thank you, Rafael, and thank you for introducing me. And I'm very glad to be here at this panel, speaking on behalf of FAO. So I will start my intervention perhaps by giving some facts and figures on the potential of the alternative proteins, and then also introduce lightly what is FAO's views and also our work. So obviously there has been a lot of increase and interest in the alternative proteins, and that's due to the various reasons. It's the ethical and environmental aspects of the traditional protein production systems, also the change of the consumers' preferences, as well as the search for sustainable solutions in feeding the increasing or rapidly growing global population. And some of our studies done by FAO shows that the estimates that plant-based proteins could reduce the land intensification up to 91%. And then up to 95% less water. They could be up to 95% less water intensive and up to 92% less carbon emissions compared to the traditional protein sources. And with the same study within Europe, the potential is up to 80% to reduce the land intensification, water intensification, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we see that there's a wider opportunities for reducing biodiversity loss, tackling climate change, as well as the reducing environmental impact. So this potential and also the interest, that's why it's increasing in the alternative proteins. However, at the same time, there are a lot of questions and a lot of unknown, which we see from our countries. And that's why also often the funding for the alternative proteins is coming from the private sector. However, we see also that there are quite few countries who are integrating that in their public funding allocations for the research, but also for the implementation. So then, moving to FAO's perspective, is that we don't see it, and in our view, is that the alternative proteins should not be seen as the silver bullet. It definitely offers a lot of potential, but it should be seen as one of the solutions. And also, and that is the reason, because there's still a lot of unknown, and we see that also in the ask from our countries through our governing bodies, that there are still the questions of the nutritious value, also the challenge what the countries are seeing is the regulations as well, and how to ensure that they are sustainable, they are not, let's say, greenwashed in a way, and also properly monitored. So in this regard, FAO is providing assessments and the research also on the alternative proteins and the nutritious value. We are also providing the policy guidance to the countries also to regulate alternative proteins and in the markets, and also in the nutrition plans at the national level. And then also we're offering the capacity building at the farmer level, so also integrating that in the circular economy and through the bioeconomy approach, and kind of helping the farmers also to apply sustainable practices of the alternative proteins. So overall, our approach is that, or FAO's view is that it shouldn't, as said, be seen as a silver bullet, but also we see that there's a lot of potential, and we see that there needs to be a diversification both of alternative and traditional proteins and intake, and that's the support and the guidance we're providing to our countries, and definitely that there's a lot of potential and future for the alternative proteins, which will work for some countries, while for other countries it might be different. So back to you, Raphael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liva. So yeah, no silver bullet solution, but one of the solutions and a lot of potential. So it's a good take, I think. So we'll have our next speaker today is Malte Clausen. Malte Clausen is a partner in Boston Consulting Group's climate and sustainability practice and a member of the leadership team for the Nordic region. He works collaboratively with clients on growth strategy across industries with a particular focus on commercializing alternative proteins. Malte came to BCG with 15 years of experience in consulting and line management. Malte, you have recently co-authored a report called Taking Alternative Proteins Mainstream. Can you please tell us a little bit more about this work that I think was published this year?
Yes, thank you so much, Raphael, and thanks for the invitation to come here and share some of our most recent insights. I think as a backdrop, it was very good, the introduction both by you, Raphael, but also Liva, in terms of the facts of what is the potential of alternative proteins, because it is quite overwhelming, the differences we see in resource requirements and greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity and all of these various parameters when you compare animal-based ingredients or animal-based proteins with alternative proteins. So there is obviously a great opportunity here to make a real impact by shifting increasingly towards plant-based and alternative proteins. But of course, it requires that we get the right products and we get the right messaging around these products. So that is what we work on at BCG together with our clients across the food system value chain on how to develop and commercialize these products. So that's the background. In terms of our most recent report, it is called Taking Alternative Proteins Mainstream. And what we looked at in that report is how is alternative proteins currently performing. So of course there's been a lot of mixed press over the last 12 to 18 months on the viability and the growth prospects of alternative proteins, in particular plant-based meat. And what we found actually is that surprisingly alternative proteins continue to grow at a quite decent rate actually. Specifically for the US, which is the biggest market here that we looked at, there was a 9% growth year on year over the last year, which is kind of a contrast to a lot of the media messages that you would otherwise see. Now, the reason for this difference is that this is mainly driven by alternative dairy. So plant-based dairy, in particular, is doing very well. And continues to capture market share. And our projection is that will continue, that the plant-based dairy and eventually also precision fermented dairy will continue to capture market share and will be on the short term will have a better outlook than plant-based meat. On the meat side, what we found is that there's still a lot of obstacles, particularly regarding consumer perception, and you could even say consumer psychology. It is a much more difficult transition to shift from animal-based meat to plant-based meat for most consumers than it is to shift from animal-based dairy to plant-based dairy. So our assessment in that regard is that there's much more innovation required, both in terms of product development, but also in terms of marketing, to really appeal much more to the mainstream. What we find in our consumer research is that while a lot of consumers will say in surveys that climate and sustainability is a top priority, when it comes to actual purchasing behavior, it tends to not be as high as people would otherwise say in surveys. So it is very important that these products they fulfill the more basic needs of consumers in terms of taste and in terms of price, but also that companies figure out ways to make it much more to normalize it, to make it much second nature that you're just eating plant-based for dinner. And it doesn't have to be, an animal every evening. So those would be the requirements. And in our latest report, Taking Alternative Proteins Mainstream, we go into a bit more details on what companies can specifically do. Final point I wanted to mention is that, of course, the corporate and investor side of this is only one piece of the puzzle for the food system transformation, and the political and the regulatory aspect is at least as important. So what we also foresee is that in terms of alternative proteins achieving a higher growth rate, there would need to be a lot more ambitious actions by governments on supporting this specific sector. In some of our other reports that we have published, we outline what some of those actions could be, and they are all, of course, available on our website. So just to summarize, the most recent report, plant-based dairy is doing much better than plant-based meat, and a lot more innovation and regulatory support is required to get plant-based meat off the ground.
Thank you so much, Malte. Thank you so much for the insights, Malte. And I think we'll have also time at the end of the session to take a few questions. So, like at the end of the session, also we'll get back to the speakers. The next speaker today is Mariana Bernal from GFI. Mariana works at the Good Food Institute Brazil, engaging directly with governments, agents, and public policymakers to foster communications between the government and market agents. She collaborates with local, global, and multilateral players to ensure that the current regulatory framework and public research funding instruments allow for the full development of the alternative protein sector in Brazil. So, Mariana, I would ask you for the next 5-6 minutes to give us maybe a perspective from Brazil on alternative proteins.
Thank you, Rafael, and good afternoon, everyone. So just for a little context, for those of you yet not familiar with GFI's work, we are a global nonprofit working across 6 regions around the globe to expand the markets for alternative proteins, collaborating with research institutes, industry stakeholders, and governments, promoting alternative proteins to create a more sustainable, safe, and secure protein supply chain. And there are a few particularities in the approach of GFI Brazil that we take when exploring the potential of alternative proteins as a climate solution, but also as a tool to transform global food systems. So this is where I'm focusing today. And taking into account not only the innovative technologies that we are discussing here today, and their clear benefits in terms of resource management and GHG emissions, but also the opportunity they present when we think of ways to add value to products already produced and consumed across our region. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, Brazil, we love meat products in Brazil, and as consumers, but primarily as producers, but we're also known for our rich biodiversity and agricultural resources. So we definitely have to look for ways in which we can remain supportive of Brazil national development, regional tastes and such, while keeping in mind that our resources are not infinite and there's a way of making the same products that we love, but also from more sustainable sources and through investment in biotechnology. So I want to talk a bit about 2 particular projects that GFI Brazil is leading. And we're talking about the Biomes program and our projects with beans. So on the Biomes project, we have the Cerrado and the Amazon as the Brazilian biomes that are most affected by deforestation. And this is often because this is aimed to free up space for land use by large plantations and livestock. So this is one consideration that GFI made when building the Biomes program was regarding the potential to explore these biomes, biodiversity, while maintaining the forest standing. That is a concept that we take on very seriously. And in the same time, there are currently thousands of families that are economically dependent on the practice of vegetable extraction, having the forest and its preservation as their main source of income. And the main goal of this project is to fund research and development on these native species for alternative products and ingredients native to the Brazilian biomes, while also adding value to species that are traditionally produced by the local communities in these regions. So we see this as a way of empowering these communities to participate in this emerging market, which is the alternative protein sector in Brazil, while fostering economic diversification and promoting both the preservation of the forest and biodiversity and the sustainable use of native resources. And so far, we are in the 3rd round of funding of these projects, having invested around $900,000 to support 20 research projects in 15 Brazilian universities and research institutes. And we're in Brazil, in GFI Brazil, we're thinking of ways to maximize the Brazilian potential as a sustainable agricultural leader through alternative proteins too. So leaving the forest for a second and coming to the Brazilian countryside, we have a great diversity of beans production through agricultural practices, as well as a very well-established production chain. And this is something that we can see in common as a global south perspective, that we do not have to rely on of our alternative protein supply of raw materials on imports, such as pea or soy. However, not all of the beans we produce, at least in Brazil, are produced for human consumption, as the broken pieces of the beans are often directed to animal feed. So in this case, we also bump in on another dilemma, that we are producing more food to feed the cattle than we are producing food to feed people. And one number that I want you to keep in mind when thinking of this dilemma is that in Brazil, as of 2021, the Brazilian population was around 214 million people, while we have a population of 224 million cows to feed for beef production. So that's where we see a great opportunity to shift away from an inefficient use of a protein-rich resource, and in turn making it a high-added value product. And for that, GFI is in close cooperation with Brazilian governments to build incentives for medium and smallholder farmers to be included in this equation, opening up new market opportunities for what they already produce, and again, in a more efficient and climate-friendly way when directing beans and pulses to the alternative protein supply chain. So that's it from my end. Happy to answer any questions in the end of the section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for these insights. So from Brazil, we'll move to the Netherlands. Our next speaker is Lucas Dupré. Lucas works as a senior policymaker at the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality. His work focuses on the nexus between climate change, agriculture and food system. He is part of the Dutch delegation to the UNFCCC and also works together with the agricultural attachés of the Netherlands, based in the embassies in the north of Africa and China. So Lucas, in the next 5 minutes, can you give us a little bit of insights of what is happening in the Netherlands?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rafael. Thank you for offering me the floor. And welcome everyone to the side event. Last month, the Aim for Climate Summit took place in Washington, D.C., and our Vice Minister of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality also participated in a dinner on alternative protein. So I'm very happy to see that also here in Bonn, again, we address this issue. And I think in the introductions and also the speakers before me already mentioned why this is important, of course, and also what's the role of alternative proteins and the protein transition towards the food system transition, and also that it is necessary if we speak about climate change. So I will not focus on that. I will focus on the Dutch policy and what we are doing in the Netherlands trying to move this topic forward. It started in 2018, so it's relatively new when the European Commission invited member states to draft national protein strategies. So the Netherlands finished this in 2020, and our strategy has an overarching aim, which is to increase the self-sufficiency rate for novel and plant proteins over the next 5 to 10 years in a sustainable way that promotes the health of people, animals, and the natural environment. And we also have a more specific policy target within this strategy, which is to realize a shift in the consumption of animal and plant-based proteins. The current ratio of animal proteins and plant-based proteins is 60-40, and our aim is to reach a 50-50 ratio, and we're also currently investigating what is required in the future to even go further. So that's what we are doing right now. And I think you can understand this is an ambitious goal because change is needed in various parts of the chain, in production, in food supply, but also, of course, in consumption. So it's not an easy one, it's an ambitious one, but we made this goal. I think to realize, very important for us is cooperation within the Netherlands with stakeholders who all have a role in this. I think we should cooperate and every stakeholder should take its responsibility. Therefore, we as a government are also cooperating with different sectors. So we cooperate with retail, hospitality sector, catering industry, etc. As an example, we are currently having talks with retail and catering to make food supply in supermarkets more plant-based and also to reduce the portion sizes of meat. To continue, I think also what is important here, and Liva, you already mentioned that there is no silver bullet, also alternative proteins is no silver bullet, but within that I also think there is no silver bullet. So we try to focus on different things. We try to focus on the cultivation of protein-rich crops. we try to focus on using insects for human and animal consumption, shift to a more plant-based diet for consumers, and to develop alternative proteins. And very promising development currently is also cultivated meat. That's important, I think, for obvious reasons. It's animal friendly, you need less land and water, and also we are looking into what it exactly does for climate change. And therefore we are supporting this development. We are currently setting up helping to develop a training, research and open access scale-up facility to help this sector, to help cultivated meat, cellular agriculture to develop in the coming years. And we are investing in the 60 million over the next 8 years. And that is the largest public investment in the sector worldwide. Also, what I would like to mention is that our efforts do not stop at our borders. We need to cooperate internationally for this. So that's what we are actively trying to do. 2 examples. We are this month, actually, here in 2023, in June, we are setting up innovation missions to Calgary in Canada and also to Minneapolis in the United States for our companies and research institutes to join these missions to exchange with other companies, other institutes in those countries so that they can learn from each other, learn from their experiences. And another example is also how we, together with other countries, for example, with and in Vietnam, are trying to develop shrimp feed for insect protein for shrimp feed. And also we are doing this, for example, in and with Indonesia to improve the sustainability of its aquaculture sector, including the use of alternative protein sources for fish feed. So I think that's important to mention here, the cooperation internationally, and therefore also it's important that we discuss it here today, I would say.
Thank you so much, Lucas. And I think, yeah, it's very interesting what is happening in the Netherlands. I think cultivated meat was also kind of like invented, or at least started a lot in the Netherlands. And when we see also the progresses made in the past years, it's pretty impressive, even though, of course, it needs, I think, a lot more like research and improvements and a lot of fundings, of course. Our next speaker will be a remote speaker. So our next speaker is Yeonju La. She is Chief Strategy Officer at Tissen BioFarm, a bio and food technology startup developing whole-cut cultivated meat in Korea. Previous to Tissen BioFarm, Yeonju served as CEO of Beyond Next, a tech startup based in South Korea with a mission to address climate change through diet. Yeonju also worked as a researcher and analyst at the President's National Economic Advisory Council, the World Health Organization. So Yeonju, maybe you can give us a little bit more insights, as we just started with cultivated meat, on the environmental impacts of cultivated meat, and how can developments of cultivated meat help address the climate crisis.
Okay. Thank you, Raphael, and hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here today virtually. I'm Yeonju, CSO of Tissen BioFarm, a food tech company making rare whole-cut meat from animal cells. I believe cultivated meat has the potential to make a significant impact in addressing the climate crisis. When we compare it to traditional animal farming, it outperforms in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, feed efficiency, land use, and animal water consumption. To provide some specific numbers, I would like to mention a recent study commissioned by GFI and conducted by CIWF. It's a comprehensive and up-to-date assessment that compares the environmental impacts of conventional animal farming to cultivated meat production in 2030. By the time we anticipate that industrial production of cultivated meat will be well underway. According to that study, cultivated meat produced using renewable energy can reduce the global warming effects of beef by up to 92%. Even when we compare it to an extremely optimistic benchmark projecting reduced environmental impacts of conventional animal farming. One important finding from the study is that most emissions from cultivated meat production comes from carbon dioxide rather than methane and nitrous oxide, which are significant greenhouse gases in cattle farming. This means that by using electricity for meat production, we have a high level of control over our carbon footprint. by transitioning to renewable energy sources in our facilities, we can reduce our carbon footprint by about 70%. We are committed to minimizing greenhouse gas emissions at every stage, including our research and development process. For instance, we prioritize physical stimuli over chemical stimuli that could generate various carbon emissions. This is a significant departure from conventional meat production, where more than 90% of carbon emissions are beyond a company's direct control, requiring coordination throughout the entire supply chain. And when it comes to feed conversion ratio, which refers to the amount of feed required to produce a certain amount of meat, cultivated meat outperforms traditional meat types. Cultivated meat is 5.8 times more efficient than beef in converting biomass into meat. We only grow cells that is necessary for meat production, specifically just the muscle and fat. We don't need to raise an entire animal that contains tissue that we don't even consume. This reduction in crop cultivation has positive downstream environmental effects such as less land use, reduced fertilizer application, and decreased pesticides use. And now let me discuss land use, which is a critical factor in mitigating climate change and biodiversity loss. Cultivated meat requires 90% less land use compared to beef. Currently, around 77% of arable land on Earth is used for animal agriculture, either to grow crops for animal feed or to graze animals. If cultivated meat replaces some aspects of traditional animal farming, we can potentially free up some of that land for other purposes. In terms of freshwater consumption, cultivated meat has the potential to decrease water usage by 66% compared to beef. At Tissen BioFarm, we are actively developing technology to grow cells without the need for growth factors and recombinant proteins. This in turn reduces water requirements for producing these materials. Additionally, there are opportunities to further reduce our water footprint through water recycling practices and adopting more sustainable approaches to water usage in the future. Another aspect to consider is energy demand. It is anticipated that cultivated meat production may require a significant amount of energy, particularly for cooling bioreactors used in cell culture. However, there is room for innovation in developing smarter and more sustainable cooling systems. And our team is also taking these factors into account as we design our production process and facility. To conclude, by embracing renewable energy and implementing energy-efficient practices, cultivated meat production has the potential to have a much lower carbon footprint compared to traditional meat production method. At Tissen BioFarm, we are committed to pursuing 100% renewable energy and are planning to install solar panels on our buildings in the future. I also encourage consumers to keep an eye on cultivated meat players' sustainability efforts. I believe all industry players, including Tissen BioFarm, are committed to proving their environmental impacts by conducting their own life cycle assessments. And we will continue our effort to find the best possible solutions for the benefit of humans, animals, and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yeonju, and thank you for staying late with us, because I think it's relatively late in Korea. So great that you could make it today. Also want to highlight to the people standing in the back, there is a few seats available in front, so feel free also to join us in front. Our next speaker is Mumukshu Patel from Climate Advisors. Mumukshu leads the food and agriculture practice at Climate Advisors, which seeks to enable a more sustainable food system leveraging innovation, diplomacy, and advocacy to help lower its greenhouse gas emissions. Mumukshu has more than 15 years of experience co-creating and implementing multi-million-dollar strategies to general social impact for Giving Pledge signatories, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, AGRA, and others. He has also consulted with multilateral development banks, civil society organizations, and the private sector on sustainable development issues. So Mumukshu, I will let you the floor for 6 to 7 minutes, or 5 to 7 minutes if you have.
Thanks, Raphael. So my background is food security and nutrition. I come to climate anew. So I just had an observation to start with, which was this is my first UNFCCC. And over here, when I hear issues about food systems, it's usually the impact of food on climate. Before this, and my colleague from FAO can appreciate this, when you're in Rome, people hear about the impact of climate on food systems, right? Because of weather volatility, cropping losses, and other things. And I think there is a subtle undercurrent where both the communities view each other in terms of trade-offs, when I think both the systems are synergistic. And if one viewed it from that angle, one would have a better solution suite to sort of reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also increase food security globally. Having said that, I also agree that alternative proteins do have the potential to address animal agriculture-related emissions, and if you don't address them, you can't meet the Paris targets. That's just a given. So one has to explore these different technologies. And alternative proteins, in my view, are largely being viewed as a northern or a western solution, which I think should not be the case. But there's a lot of investment being driven by the private sector to develop products, whether it's Beyond Meat or Impossible Burgers or what have you. And this is the time that one should start developing a more of a global public good framework for alternative proteins. So this would not only include things like tech transfer. I mean, previously the CIWF centers, which were created by Ford and Rockefeller, did this for other technologies, which were hybrid crops. One does not want to replicate the environmental experiences of the Green Revolution, but what I want to speak to is that there was capacity development, there was the potential to generate innovation in the global south for crops that were relevant to the global south. And one can do the same for alternative proteins, and one should think about it. Otherwise, it tends to become more of a northern-led approach. This would require not only investments by philanthropies and government ODA, but also one should think about your development finance corporations and others to engage with southern companies to help also de-risk their investments in this space. The other aspect is when you think about some of these alt protein technologies, again, using my experience from the food security side, is that a lot of varieties that are developed, whether by CG centers or others, they don't take into account the perspective of the end user. So for instance, if the rice variety being developed is yielding more, has more vitamin content, but it's very hard to cook, then it's not going to be sort of adopted at scale. So that divide between discovery, development, and delivery is pretty high in some of the food innovation space, and that needs to be brought closer together. So a focus on product development, as was alluded earlier, is really important. And there's a lot of modeling work that's been done stating that alternative proteins will become like an $800 billion industry, generate jobs between 50 to 100 million. But a lot of that needs to also happen in the context of the global south, because you want to know what sort of displacements are going to occur, what sort of de-risking needs to be happening on that side. And the last point that I would want to make is that in the past, with particularly food and ag technologies, there have been divides between North America and Europe that have then been foisted on countries in Africa, Asia, not so much on Latin America. And those sorts of divides should not be used to be conditioning your ODA and other things, whether you have what sort of alt protein policy you have or not. And that's a risk that is pretty substantial with developments in Europe these days, and we want to move ahead of that curve if we can, if we're going to be effective advocates of alternative proteins. So with that, I'd like to end.
Thank you so much, Mushu. Thank you. And I think, we'll have again like a little bit of time for questions and answers after this panel. Our next speaker is Kinia Hofmeier. Kinia is a policy officer at the FAIRR initiative, heading their work on the FAO-led global roadmap to 2050 for food and agriculture. Her main focus areas are sustainable agriculture and climate finance. Kenya has 5 years of experience in corporate sustainability, previously working with companies on their ESG disclosures and TCFD alignment, as well as the European Commission on fisheries policy. So Kenya, I'll let you the floor for 6-7 minutes.
Thank you, Raphael. It's great to be here today. As Raphael said, I'm a policy officer with the FAIRR initiative. And for anyone who's unaware, FAIRR is an investor network which focuses on the ESG risks and opportunities within the global food system. At present, our investor network currently represents over 70 trillion in assets under management. And in the past few years, we've seen investors already beginning to address the risks of climate change in their agricultural investments specifically. In doing so, they are increasingly recognizing the commercial and climate mitigation potential found in alternative proteins. Investment in alternative proteins grew to over $5 billion in 2021. I believe that came from a GFI study. And we found that 50% of companies in the FAIRR Protein Producer Index, which assesses the largest animal protein producers on critical ESG issues, they found that now they have exposure to alternative proteins at a figure that has doubled since 2019. So big progress seen there. FAIRR has also run a collaborative engagement on sustainable proteins that encourages global food companies to systemically transition product portfolios to facilitate healthier, more sustainable diets set to climate targets. And what's interesting in this engagement is that it has grown, and in the year 2021 to 2022, we had 84 investor members representing $23 trillion in asset under management, asking companies to set time-bound commitments to reduce emissions and diversify their product portfolios as a part of an evidence-based approach to protein diversification. So from this engagement, 8 of the 23 companies assessed now have targets to increase the volumes of sales in meat and dairy alternatives, and 100% of companies in our engagement are investing in the development of plant-based proteins. This type of investor engagement with companies is increasingly important because the recently released FAIRR Climate Risk Tool, which was developed in partnership with IASA, quantified the materiality of risks and opportunities for the largest livestock producers and provided some striking insights with this data. It looked at the rising cost of animal feed as well as the direct effect of heat stress on livestock companies and their profitability. And they did that depending on 3 different climate scenarios, and that was a scenario where the world achieved 1.5 degrees, was at 2 degrees, or well beyond 2 degrees. And essentially what the tool found was that the climate costs pose a systemic risk to the sector's profitability, and actually half of the 40 companies assessed in this tool operated at a loss by 2030. So it's clear that a stable climate and natural ecosystems are key for our food production and for our economy at a global scale. So investors are increasingly taking note of this and influencing this change. Just last year, FAIRR facilitated investors with over $18 trillion in assets under management, calling for a clear roadmap for the agriculture and land use sector by 2050. And we called that this roadmap align with climate goals, nature goals, and of course, food security goals. This was backed by Ban Ki-moon, Cristina Figueres, and the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And this was an important signal because investors can influence policy change required to drive this roadmap and commit to redirecting the financial flows where they need to go, such as in areas of underinvestment in the agricultural sector or through technological innovation and methane-reducing investment policies. So what we have seen is that many investors are already realigning their portfolios, and an agricultural roadmap would be very useful to continue this endeavor. Our original investor letter highlighted 3 important goals for the roadmap. Of course, 1, that it be aligned with the Paris Agreement and stick to 1.5 degrees warming. 2, that it protects and restores nature. And 3, that it achieves our global food and nutrition security goals. And this should also include core targets around healthy diets and action points on shifting to a more sustainable diet, particularly in the global north where we see the overconsumption of animal protein. So fortunately at COP27, as we all know, the FAO heeded this call and agreed to produce a global roadmap to 2050 for the agricultural sector. And this showed a big step change in the focus on food systems as a vital sector for climate action and also for investment as well, because investment continues to fall short of what is needed in this sector. So it's really great that we are scaling this up. At COP28, what we hope to see is a step up in the pace and of setting of clear goals and laying out pathways. We can do this largely with the FAO roadmap by involving a strategic plan that defines our goals for the agricultural sector and includes major milestones that we need to hit between now and 2050. If we look back at 2021 with the IEA Net Zero Roadmap for global energy sector, they did just that by outlining clear milestones with different subsectors involved at 5-year intervals, so 2030, 2035, all the way up to 2050. And we hope that the FAO Roadmap for Agriculture follows a similar structure. We envision that these milestones would define a specific goal that needs to be achieved to reach our ultimate objective of a sustainable food system by 2050. And it is hoped that through this roadmap, we can keep the 1.5-degree goal alive.
Thank you so much, Kenia. And yeah, I think we'll have a good discussion probably afterwards also on the roadmap and all the things that are happening since Sharm el-Sheikh. Our next speaker, Helen Howard, could unfortunately not make it, so we are already at our last speaker today, and we'll have then time for Q&A. Helen Regina is from India and is now based in Germany. She is pursuing her master's degree in food quality and safety and is the president of the Bayreuth-Kulmbach Alternative Protein Society based in Kulmbach, Germany. The goal of the student society is to make alternative proteins an approachable addition to daily diets while providing students and other interested parties with simplified, unbiased scientific information on alternative proteins. So Helen, I'll let you the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Hello, everyone. I first want to introduce our society. So we're based in a little town called Kulmbach, which is in the south of Germany in Franconia. And we were founded in October 2020, and it's actually one of the student chapters or student groups that is supported by the Good Food Institute. And we work on building future food, basically. And one of that is definitely alternative proteins. And what we do is we read scientific literature or scientific papers and every single update in the industry about new foods entering the market. And we make fun, creative Instagram posts and also flyers on simplified information about this just for the consumers. Today, actually, I had a very interesting conversation in the cafeteria that people perceive alternative proteins as something unnatural, that it's not something familiar, that they're familiar with. And I think this is actually one of the keys to unlocking the true potential of alternative proteins. So what is consumer need necessarily? We need to figure that out. And also we need to know what need is expected or what is the need of each community. Some communities are more plant-based, so we target plant-based alternative proteins to those communities and cultivated meat to meat eaters, etc. And another thing is consumer perception, exactly the conversation that I had in the cafeteria. Is how familiar are they with this? And one way to make alternative proteins familiar is by spreading information, that it's not just science, that it's something that we can definitely adapt to. We have adapted to many things as human beings, and this is also having a very good potential. And we need to keep in mind that just acceptance and an intention of a person doesn't necessarily mean a change in behavior, that it takes time. And this is of course a challenge, but it is also something that we can tackle as we tackle many scientific challenges with alternative proteins. And we also really want to, what we do in the student society is also try to push for support in academia. Academic research provides very neutral scientific evidence, because we collect or we analyze, we prepare systematic reviews and meta-analysis from various industries. And we provide neutral evidence to consumers, so through student societies like ourselves, but also academic research that is produced by PhD students and professors who are working at our faculty, and many other student groups that are supported by GFI do this as well. So these are some of the key ways to do this, and the problem with that is that alternative proteins haven't really entered the market in order for us to have enough information about like long-term effects of alternative proteins. So we are lacking evidence. For this, policy needs to change, that this support between policy so that it gets into the market and then we get enough alternative proteins in the market to do research and produce good scientific evidence is necessary. So in conclusion, I also, and one nice thing that we do at the university is also that we have a course on alternative proteins. And this is something that I think is a very simple but underestimated potential, that is education. Just as we talk about simple sciences, chemistry, physics, we need to now incorporate also alternative proteins so that it becomes normal, so that it becomes familiar to everyone. And yeah, so it truly has a potential, and I think these are some of the ways in which we could truly unlock the potential. And in conclusion, I would say that we can definitely shift this unnatural perception, and that's also what I told the person, that we already have processed foods in the market. We just didn't realize it because now alternative protein information is also very transparent. We do see that, oh, this is how it's processed, etc. But this is definitely, we could definitely face this challenge by collaborating with different target groups, with specific target groups, and we need to keep in mind this need, perception, and good academic knowledge in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen, and I also would like to acknowledge the voice of youth, I think, in the past years, and also getting food systems transformation discussion, healthy diets, or like alternative proteins like on the map. It's also, I think, like something that we're witnessing in the past like 2-3 years at a good level. But of course, we'll need like much more discussion on food systems, I think, at COPs in general. But this is like already a good progress, and I think the voice of youth was crucial for that. I would like now to open the floor for questions, and I think we'll take probably a first round of 3 questions, get to the panel, and then get back to you. So do we have the microphones? Yeah, wonderful.
Hello, does it work? Yeah, fantastic. So I have a question to the panel, but particularly to Malte. So you spoke about how regulatory support could really help in this, and we have heard some fantastic regulatory programs, for example, by Lucas, which I was particularly impressed by. So I was wondering, what do you think would be necessary in terms of regulatory support specifically? And then part of that, how would the support for protein alternative dairy products be different from alternative meat products?
Sorry, could you introduce yourself just before?
Yeah, my name is Miklos Vespremi. I'm a consultant in sustainability topics from Zurich.
Thank you. So we'll take 2 more questions, and again, like the panel is free also to answer and jump into other questions if there is.
Hello, thanks for being here. My name is Carmen Stepik, and I'm a PhD student at a medical college in Dublin. And my question is regarding educating people on nutrition in general, and not just cutting out meat. You have these stories from sort of anti-vegan media that say, oh, there's children dying because they have a plant-based diet, or you know, you have processed foods that don't have meat in them, but it doesn't mean they're good for you. You can go to Burger King or McDonald's and get an Impossible Burger. So what are you doing to actually educate people and make sure this is about human health and nutrition and not just cutting out meat and climate change? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had one more in front. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Tobias Gijs with the Danish Agriculture and Food Council, so representing farmers and cooperatives. A question to Malte and Lucas Dupré on the political economy of all this, and in particular on the cellular meats and likely also dairy. Assuming that these projections materialize, then it's transformative developments, and there would be, well, already now we see in Italy a ban on this because of pressure groups vocal and voicing fears. How historically in agriculture farmers have joined up in cooperatives to get part of the added value in the food system. This arguably could spark a concentration of power, like we see in the tech economy. How would farmers benefit? I mean, I'm talking about the existing ones from cellular meats, and how would part of that product, the billion-dollar economy that was mentioned, how would that be shared? And when the Dutch government is investing 60 million euros, how is that going to help Dutch farmers transition? We've seen them in the streets to a more sustainable way of income. So is there a cooperative model for cellular meat?
Thank you. So we'll start with this round of question, and as Malte, you were mentioned twice, I'll let you maybe start with taking that, and if anyone on the panel wants to react, feel free to join in.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so the first question was, what kind of regulation would be required to support the growth of alternative proteins? And here it's this was outlined in our report of last year, so the one before the recent one. At least 3 obvious areas would be alignment of subsidies. So obviously right now subsidies are misaligned with the Paris Agreement. There's way too much subsidies going towards animal agriculture relative to plant-based if we are to reach the Paris climate targets. So a realignment of subsidies would be one obvious way that would benefit the alternative protein sector. Climate labeling would be a second clear way because of all of the facts that we've heard here today. Labeling so consumers actually understand what is the impact, the environmental and the climate impact of the various food products is also a very direct way that governments can support more sustainable food consumption. And the third one would be carbon taxation. So a carbon tax would also benefit the alternative protein segment relatively more than the animal-based system, given the differences in emission intensity. So these are 3 of the areas that we've mentioned previously, and yeah, that would be a start at least. Then the second question was specifically on cultivated meat. How can this benefit farmers? And here our assessment is that it's very important that farmers get the support they need on this transition towards more sustainable agriculture, regardless of whether you are eating animal-based products or plant-based products or fermented products or cultivated products. Ultimately, there are going to be input coming from agriculture and coming from farmers. So we all rely on farmers, and no matter what your diet is, you should be thankful for the farmers that are providing you those ingredients and ultimately those products. So that's very important. What we would say is two things. One is that there are a lot of farmers that are actually struggling today economically. So the current food system has some challenges, not only in all of the areas we've heard here today, but also actually economically and financially for the farmers in the current system. So there's definitely a need for rethinking the very structure of the food system to benefit farmers more. And then, of course, there are numerous examples of how farmers have been able to transition in, like, for example, going from dairy farming to oat farming, if you talk about the plant-based transition. And, of course, input from agriculture will be required also in fermented and cell-based products. So that will be needed to work closely together with farmers to make it beneficial for all parts of the value chain.
Thank you so much, Malte. I think there was a question on the Netherlands, so maybe Lucas, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, and also thank you for the question. Adding to what was being said, because I think that perfectly also was an overview of what should be done. Focusing more on the Netherlands, what we do see indeed is that in the Netherlands because we are very efficient agricultural sector, which we have built through innovation and optimization of processes over the years. At the same time, we're currently seeing that we're crossing the borders, the barriers of what a healthy system is. So that means that we are currently in a transition, in the food system transition, which has just been mentioned in the Netherlands right now. It's a difficult process because there are a lot of different interests in this one. What we try to do as a government is to bring everyone together and to show, to demonstrate and to point to the urgency that something has to be done. So we need to transit to more sustainable agriculture. We do that with all stakeholders on board, also farmers, because they're one of the stakeholders and they should be included, and they are included. So that's basically how we go about that. At the same time, this also shows the boundaries of what a healthy system can take, is that we have to look into these kind of options, such as alternative proteins and cultivated meat, etc., and what they can bring us also to this debate and towards the future. So I think we have to pay attention to both things. To the farmers, which are in a system which is currently in transition, and we have to pay sufficient attention that everyone is included there, including farmers. At the same time, we have to look for these new developments and see what they can offer us in order to let food production and consumption take place within the boundaries of a healthy planet.
Thank you, Lucas. Would anyone else on the panel like to react to one of the questions? Liva?
Yeah, just to address your question about the extremes and the arguments about not sufficient availability of animal-based proteins versus going the other extreme, completely vegan or so. So I think it's also important to see different regional and geographical contexts as well. And obviously, we don't speak about the let's say the protein deficit in Europe. That's a different case now. These extreme arguments are made for the countries where perhaps, there is food insecurity and no access to the proteins. So I think it's also important to understand, and that's what I meant by the silver bullet. We have to really look at the national and the local context. So it's obviously in these kind of debate, there are very extreme arguments at both sides made, and it's important to also justify then the context when we speak about the animal access to the proteins and then animal versus plant based. Over.
Thank you, Liva. Would anyone else like to react to the questions? Helen?
Just about the nutrition, I think highly processed foods in general are not healthy. It doesn't matter if it comes from plant sources or animal sources. So the amount of highly processed meats or burgers like McDonald's that you consume should be reduced despite which source it comes from, because it's fast food. So fast food is more the issue and not alternative protein-based fast food. That's the issue, I think, just to add to, also.
Thank you. Anyone else wanted to react to something? No. So also like on the health aspect and the education, I think was also raised. I think it's a big part also of our work at ProVeg. We got the Momentum for Change award on that, like on educating also, like, you know, the educational programs where we go to schools and where we cook also with kids. We show like the value of food. So it's not, I think, you know, also like a silver bullet solution again, where we want to have like alternative proteins like everywhere all the time. We want people to have healthy, balanced nutrition, but we really know that, you know, the extreme at the moment is clearly to have like a consumption around 90 kilos of meat per inhabitants, like my country, and that's something that is really problematic. So I think, you know, if we're serious about reducing that from 90 to maybe 20, whatever, like, you know, what recommendations, the recommendations are depending also on countries, but something that is a little bit more in line with dietary guidelines, I think would be already a good progress and would also have a good impact also on emissions. We would take like 3 more questions. So yeah, the microphone will come.
Thank you all. I am Munir. I'm from Morocco, and I'm from IAS, the International Association of Students in Agriculture. I believe we should all go towards a healthier diets and sustainable. But my question when it comes to food systems transformation, to all the panelists, what is your vision and to what extent you think farmers are included in this transformation we're talking about? If we all ask people to consume less meat, for example, then farmers that produce meat, where would they be if nobody eats meat anymore? What would they become? What would be their income? How would they live? From like, I don't know how you think about it and what you think should be an alternative. We should engage them in the discussion to also think what they should be an alternative for them and all the families they have from a personal point of view. If someone has an idea about it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Darina, and I'm a delegate from Ukraine. And I would like to come back to the silver bullet moment. We have talked a lot today about policies and educating people and the regional context, of course. That's also very important. However, to me, it more sounds like the means of getting to an endpoint. And whereas alternative proteins are part of the endpoint, part of the solution. So my question is not necessarily to Liva, but to anyone who wants to take it. What other components do you see then of this climate-friendly, net zero agriculture by 2050 or later? What else is there except for alternative proteins or cultivated meat that could reduce emissions?
Thank you. We'll take one more and we'll get back to the panel.
Thank you. I'm Jan Wolf from Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation. I just have a quick question to Lucas from the Netherlands. I like your presentation about your strategy, the national strategy in food system transformation, and especially how the aim to shift away from meat consumption to plant-based consumption. So I was just wondering whether all this is part of the Netherlands' nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. If there is one more question, we could still take it, but I think we were good. So we'll get back to the panel. Who would like to start? Yeah, Mariana.
Oh. Yeah, so taking the questions on the role that farmers would have in case that we substitute the animal products to plant-based meat or alternative proteins in general. At least in a Brazilian perspective, so we have the case for big farmers and landowners in Brazil. So mostly cattle owners and soy producers the production is all concentrated in the hands of big landowners. So this is a major issue also in Brazil because we're having to face issues of deforestation and illegal occupation of the Amazon forest. So this is actually something that would try to solve through alternative proteins and to promote producing meat in a more sustainable way. That's why we are trying to promote plant-based meat. And another aspect of involving smallholder farmers and also smallholder farmers is the case that I mentioned about the beans. So we're actually taking into account what these producers already produce. We're not trying to teach them how to produce or what they should be producing to fulfill a demand or a market need. It's just making it more profitable for them and trying to include them in this equation and in this transformation. We're only trying to connect these dots and trying to present them with a new opportunity to improve the circularity of the products that they are already producing. And also the case for native and local communities in the Amazon and in Cerrado, it's exactly the same. We want to build a sustainable protein supply chain where they can actually take advantage of a market that they are not included yet, and taking what would be taken into the trash out of their production and trying to build another market opportunity through these products. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mariana. We have only 5 minutes separating us from the reception. So if anyone wants to also add a point, that would be also the moment, and also maybe a closing, if you have a closing sentence or anything that you would like to add. Let Lucas maybe first.
Yes, thank you, Rafael, and thank you for the follow-up questions, of course. Briefly then on the second question, climate-friendly agriculture, what would it entail apart from alternative proteins and a protein transition? Well, I think very important is indeed consumption, so that's a valid point, and that's also why we're here discussing it. Next to that, I think also with other types of production, we should look into deforestation. Deforestation is a major contributor, of course, to it happens for agricultural purposes, and this is really adds up to climate change. So I think we should really pay attention to that and look further into it and go over to more action. And also in other production methods, I think they're an interesting option. I think we can look into, for example, horticulture, where horticulture, if you produce within greenhouse gases, for example, can make sure that you produce the same amount of food more efficiently, so using less water and land, for example. Particularly on the NDC question, because it was, to me, I do not know. I assume, of course, it will help if we move to a different ratio. So from 60-40, now the goal is to go to 50-50. It will help. The exact amount in percentages, I do not know, but we can exchange cards afterwards and look it up afterwards if you want to. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Would anyone else like to add something? Kenya?
Yeah, just to that second question on how to go towards a more climate-friendly agricultural system, I think, and this was mentioned earlier, agricultural subsidies and subsidy reform needs to be at the heart of that. So FAIRR, we recently launched an investor statement calling on G20 finance ministers to repurpose or transform the agricultural subsidies. If you look globally, about 2/3 of agricultural transfer payments in the forms of subsidies come without any strings attached, and this is across governments. So what we see in practice is that means a fifth of every dollar is used to raise meat and a 10th to raise dairy. And even the non-meat or dairy crops that farmers choose to grow still tend to be wheat or other crops that we have an overconsumption of that tend to be used in sugar and oil-based products. So we need to really look at how these subsidies are used and really put in the policies that make the subsidies go towards crops and nutrition that is good for our health and for the environment.
Thank you, Kenya. Mokshu?
Just 2 quick points. One was on the political economy of cultivating or cellular meat that you pointed out too. But I'd also point to that when there are certain public bans like tobacco, there's a very different set of farmer support, and how do you get around it? And there are ways of doing it. Same holds with the rancher situation. And to the point of more, how do you build more sustainable food systems other than all proteins? I think one of the key food system drivers is nitrous oxide. about 80% of anthropogenic nitrous oxide emissions come from the food system. And it's largely a forgotten gas because of various political economy questions as well. But targeting that, particularly with middle-income countries like India and China, footing a huge subsidy bill on fertilizers. There has been some good innovation on nanofertilizers being delivered through drip irrigation and other things. But to my European and American friends, I'd say it's time to use less fertilizer, and that more precision farming can help. So redirecting subsidies toward that would also help.
Thank you so much, Mokshu. So yeah, we are, I think, yeah, we're going to close now the session. I would just like to thank all the organizers and the panelists for also sticking to the time. It was a lot of different topics that I think we tackled. One important thing, I think, is to acknowledge that alternative proteins are a key part of the solution. There was a very depressing article just a few years ago, actually, in Le Monde about my home country, France. Why do French people eat actually more meat than 10 years ago? The consumption had increased by 3% because of various factors. But clearly, the absence or the fact that alternative proteins are much more difficult also to buy in a supermarket, even in big cities, etc., that the pricing is not the same. There is no level playing field. You pay triple the price. Many things like that clearly showed that we are not there yet. So if we are serious about transforming our food systems and diversifying our protein intakes, alternative proteins have a key role to play. They're not a silver bullet solution, but they're such a big part of the solution that we should talk about that, I think, much more also at the UN and at different forums and with our governments to make sure that we also allow a transition towards less resource intensive food systems that could also benefit everyone, in particular when we see what is going to happen with the increasing meat consumption in other regions. So that would be my final take, and thank you so much for attending and for participating. And now we're very happy to invite you for a little reception, a few glasses of wine and plant-based meats, and yeah, happy to chat further with that. Thank you.